So why is it that you are labeled as such an extremist?
I'm banned off all mainstream social media. I'm banned from having a bank account. I'm banned from traveling to 29 countries in Europe.
I was going to ask you what you thought about the replacement theories, but you've pretty much answered. It's not a theory at this point.
In a quarter of a century, our share of the population has dropped by 20%. The state is doing everything in its power to bring about this situation. It's not accidental.
I think most people say that their main concern would be Islam, right? And how that's affecting the country. But then you also get others that say, actually, well, Israel has played a big part. Who do you think is the bigger concern?
And this is so curious. On one hand, they want an ethno-state for in the Middle East, but on the other hand, they want a multi-ethnic, multi-racial state for the English. The Israel lobby has a complete stranglehold, not just on UK politics, but largely on Western politics.
How do you feel about a lot of these right-wing commentators, podcasters? We have Liam Tufts. What do you think is going on there?
Yeah, I'm going to call out Tommy Robinson here, because that man is a moral coward.
It's becoming more and more clear why you've been deplatformed so much. Quick message before we start. This chat was very much needed, and it is no understatement to say Mark is one of the most censored people in the UK. And once you listen to the full episode, you start to understand why that's the case. If you're a regular listener or you're new here, all I ask is that you please share this episode. I've already been taken off the airways once, and ultimately the whole point of this show is to try and reach as many ears as possible and make people aware. Anyways, that's enough from me. I hope you enjoy. For the first time in over a century, we are seeing the collapse of the two biggest political parties in the UK. Both Labour and Conservative have lost all trust with the people. We're seeing both the far left and the far right rise to power. To try and make sense of this, with me today is the leader of the Patriotic Alternative Party, Mark Collett. Mark, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. And we're not actually a party. We are basically a community-based group. We believe in three things, which is community, advocacy, and activism. We aren't actually a political party. We're actually blocked by the Electoral Commission for a number of ridiculous reasons from becoming a political party. But in the current climate, I don't think it's good for nationalist or patriotic groups to all form their own tiny micro parties, because I believe the only party that has really a chance of breaking the stranglehold that the Conservatives and Labour have had on British politics for really about a century is Reform. Reform are going to occupy that space, and organisations like Patriotic Alternative are needed for other things. So we have conferences, we have family camps, we have family events. We also raise money for political prisoners. We engage in things like homeless outreach, as well as doing traditional political activism, sort of anti-migrant demonstrations, leafleting, banner drops. So we cover really those three sectors: community, advocacy, and activism. And we might get involved in helping other candidates at election time, but we don't believe the parliamentary political route is open or productive for smaller groups like ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, this is always one of the criticisms of like our voting system, right? It's not proportionate. But you're right. It's Reform looks like it's just going to absolute steamroll this and have majority of the seats. And so many people are over the moon at the fact that Labour and Conservative are finally gone. But I mean, what is interesting is, what you're suggesting there, and we'll get into it, obviously, but they're all very reasonable things. So why is it that you are labelled as such an extremist?
Well, look, the state singles people out and then silences them. Now, I don't exactly know what goes on in these state meetings, but I think over the next hour and a half, you're going to ask me whatever you want to ask me, and I'll give you my opinion. But I think most people listening might not agree with everything, but they wouldn't find me unreasonable. And I think there's people who take far harder stances than I do that are still allowed on platforms like X, Facebook, and YouTube. Yet I'm not. I'm banned off all mainstream social media. I'm banned from having a bank account. I'm banned from traveling to 29 countries in Europe, as well as America and Canada. Yet, it may shock you, I have never broken the law. I've never been found guilty in a court of law of any crime. I've never taken part in any kind of fraudulent activity or anything that would have a bank account closed. Every time a decision like this is made against me, I am never ever furnished with a reason as to why this has taken place, and I am never privy to evidence against me. It's just, we made this decision, you can appeal it, but we're not telling you exactly why, and we're certainly not giving you any evidence as to why this may have taken place. Whereas there are people that I think take a slightly harder line than me, and I'm not knocking those people, I'm certainly not punching right, but they're allowed on these platforms and I'm not. And this is very frustrating because a lot of people slander me, they say terrible things about me, but I'm not really given a right to reply.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I've felt censorship, and the most censorship, or what's it called? The most shadow banning that I've received was always when I was talking around the lockdowns and the vaccines and everything else. So it doesn't take much to get censored nowadays. I can completely sympathize with this. And it is weird. We are seeing this. It seems like a lot of topics which you were never able to talk about before are now being completely normalized. But I guess how would you define yourself then? Because, you know, like you were saying earlier, nationalism's on the rise. Would you say you're a nationalist? Or I know in the media they label you as like, what would you say is more accurate?
Well, when people ask me in public, the simple answer is a nationalist. But if you want a very sort of on-the-nose definition, I'm an ethno-nationalist. I believe that we in Britain need to put our own ethnic groups first, i.e. the English, the Scottish and the Welsh. They are ethnic groups, part of the larger white
sorry,
race.
I was just going to say, you hear these terms a lot too. So ethno-nationalists and civic nationalists. Could you, for those who don't know, could you explain the differences as well?
Well, an ethno-nationalist believes in the importance of race and ethnicity. We believe that our culture, our heritage and our traditions are tied to our ethnic group. So being English is something that is from birth. You are English, and being English ties you to the English culture, because the English culture, our traditions, were birthed from the English people. So ethnicity is important. However, civic nationalists believe that anyone can come to England, and if they embrace our culture and our traditions, they can effectively become English. I don't believe that. I think ethnicity is important. I think our ethnic groups, which are part of the larger racial group, which is the white race, people of European descent, I think that's important. And I don't want the English people to become a minority in England, or the Scottish people to become a minority in Scotland. And if you look at the census, the British census, the census collectively terms the English, the Scottish and the Welsh as white British. So I will go out and I will campaign and say white Britons should not become a minority in Britain. And currently we're around 70% of the population. That was 24/25. But we've got there really quickly. In 1999-2000, we were roughly 90% of the population. So in a quarter of a century, our share of the population has dropped by 20%. And if you follow that through, in another quarter of a century, by about 2050, if the trends continue that have been accelerating post the year 2000, post the Blair regime, where mass immigration was really ramped up, we will be staring down the barrel of being a minority in our own country. And I just don't think that's acceptable. I don't think it's acceptable for an Englishman to be a minority in England, any more than I would think it was acceptable for a Japanese man to be a minority in Japan. I think every ethnic group deserves a place in the world, and in that place they shouldn't be reduced to a minority, and they should control the political systems in their own homeland. They should control the land in their own homeland. You know, there's many countries out there that have very restrictive laws on letting foreigners purchase land. But you go to somewhere like London, and I think something like 40% of the housing stock or 40% of the land in London is owned by foreign investors. I think that's, again, that's sort of antithetical to my beliefs about ethno-nationalism, and that this country should embrace ethno-nationalism and should be run for the benefit of the indigenous people.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you hear a lot of these arguments nowadays, and obviously you speak to a liberal person, they would say that the country is for everyone. but this is only prominent in the West. And then if you said to them, well, who does Palestine belong to then? Well, the Palestinians, of course. Right. So why, make that make sense? But it's one of them things, isn't it? Our culture and our history gets trashed so much, but whether people like to admit it or not, we've built such a beautiful country that there's a reason why everyone wants to come to us. And, maybe there's those opportunists who just want to try and, drain whatever they can for the economy. And obviously that goes on. But the reality is that we're not really going abroad. They're coming to us. And, there's been people like Dominic Cummings who knows the internal systems of UK politics. And, I heard you say 75% British right now, but, he goes on to say how they don't actually know what the real numbers are. And me personally, I've seen it as estimates as low as 65%. I've seen in the census, they say 40% of the British school.
Well, look, I can give you a very detailed breakdown on this if you wish.
What do you think? What do you think is the accurate numbers right now?
Well, firstly, I want to discuss the census just very briefly. So the census is important and it takes place every decade. And the last census was 2021. Now, the census is best case scenario, and it's always best case scenario because firstly, it doesn't report people who are here illegally. And the number of illegal migrants in Britain is now estimated between about 1.4 million and 2 million. So that's a sizable number of people that aren't included. Wow. There is also the issue that the census is biased towards English-speaking, law-abiding, tax-paying citizens that have nothing to hide. It does not include people who have 10 people living under one roof and doing some council tax scam. It does not include huge families where nobody speaks English. So you could accurately say the census is very, very biased in favour of white Brits who are law-abiding, tax-paying citizens and excludes lots of people who are here illegally and lots of people who are here legally but are gaming the system, that are abusing the benefits system, and that are also not fluent in our native tongue. They don't speak English, they don't speak Welsh. Simple as that. So at this last census, they said 74.4% of the population was white British. Now, that's obviously best case scenario. But after that, we had the Boris wave. We had this huge wave of immigration under the Conservatives. And now the media are saying it's about 70%. But about 70% is a very sort of fluffy, fuzzy number. But as I said earlier, we've got to 70% from 90% in 25 years, which averages sort of a 0.8% decrease per year. But again, that's a very positive look at it because it hasn't been 0.8%, 0.8%, 0.8%, 0.8%. The demographic change has been increasing. So if you actually looked at it on a graph, the rate of demographic change increases over time. It's not something that is static. It's not something that's a flat line. But then it gets worse than what I've just said, because when you look at the demographic pyramid, the demographic changes are the most severe in the youngest age bracket. So when you look at people who are in old people's homes, if you look at people over the age of 65, I think there's something like 12.7 million people over the age of 65 in Britain. Now, the vast majority of those, 93%, are white British. So you're talking about 11.8 million white Britons over the age of 65. And in 25 years' time, around 11.2 to 11.3 million of those white Britons will be dead, as there's only 600,000 people in Britain who are over the age of 90. So that's just a statistical fact. Over the next 25 years, we're going to see this huge dying off of elderly white Britons. But what's going on in maternity wards is the very opposite. In maternity wards, you have the most diverse area of the population. So for the year ending 2024, when you look at the ethnic makeup of maternity wards in England and Wales, white British births made up just 51.2% of all live births in England and Wales. So the most diverse part of the population are newborns. The least diverse are the elderly. And the future of a nation does not lie in old people's homes. It lies in the maternity wards. So when you take into account these three factors, you have births which are rapidly shifting towards a situation where white Britons will be a minority in the next few years in maternity wards. You have deaths where the vast majority of people in old people's homes are elderly, white, and you're going to see a huge dying off. But then on top of all of that, you have massive immigration figures, both illegal and legal. So these three factors are causing a demographic shift on an unprecedented level that will reduce our people to a minority in about a quarter of a century from where we are now. And I think that's very frightening. I think if you laid that out to people, they would be shocked. Many people would be deeply uncomfortable about that. But there are many other factors surrounding this. And earlier you said, the way they attack our history, the way they, attack our culture, the way they attack, our way of life. Well, Marcus Garvey, who was actually a black man, a black nationalist, he said, a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. And one of the reasons we're facing this demographic catastrophe is because the establishment, the media, and the government have done everything they can to sever white Britons from their history, their culture, their heritage, their traditions. And whereas other racial groups in Britain, other ethnic groups in Britain, are cohesive communities with an in-group preference, they've stuck together, they embrace their culture, their heritage, etc. We, as white Britons, we're isolated individuals, and we're made to feel guilty if we have any in-group preference. So if you say to a Muslim man, a Jewish man, a Sikh man, a Hindu man, who would you rather employ in your business? They would all choose somebody primarily from their community. If you said to a white man, who would you rather employ in your business? A white man has been conditioned to feel guilty if he says, well, I'd rather employ somebody like me. I'd rather employ a fellow Englishman because I've got more in common with him. He's part of my community. I want to help people out in my community. If he said that, he would feel immediately guilty if he felt that way. And there are actually laws in place that could punish him if he went down that route. But these laws are selectively enforced. So you do go to Muslim areas and they are completely Islamic. But when there's any white area, and the same with Jews and Hindus and Sikhs, they all do the same. You have somebody like Anthony Joshua stand up at a Black Lives Matter rally and say that black people should only spend money at black businesses. And he's cheered, he's allowed to make money, no one closes his bank account down. Now imagine if I stood up at a rally and said white people should only spend money at white-owned businesses. We should only go to the local farm shop. We should only go to small, stores, bakeries, butchers owned by our people. Spend your English pounds with English business owners. Well, if I had a bank account, I'd lose it. I'd be banned for saying it. I'd be called a monster. And a good example of this in the real world is when we, as Patriotic Alternative, did a Christmas present drive. We did a Christmas present drive for disadvantaged children. And we said we wanted to give disadvantaged Indigenous British children, so, white British children, a better Christmas. And it was called the White Christmas Campaign. We got a letter from the Equalities Commission saying if we ever did anything like that again, they would take us to court, they would sue us, and they'd attempt to close us down. Now, who is suing all of these charities and groups that only provide services for ethnic minorities? Because there are many of them. I don't need to name them all, but if you go and Google charities that provide services exclusively for ethnic minorities in the UK, There are dozens, if not hundreds. But the first group that attempts to do that for white Britons, they get threatened with being closed down. They get banned off social media. They have their bank accounts closed down. And you then look at this and you take a step back and you can see why we're being reduced to a minority. Because the state is doing everything in its power to bring about this situation. It's not accidental. There is malice of forethought here. This isn't a series of unfortunate events or accidents or poor policy decisions. This is being forced upon us. And you can see this with the current Labour government. So the current Labour government have said, well, we're going to reduce immigration a little bit, but they've been caught out lying already on their immigration numbers. Originally said they'd got it down to 200,000, but now the Telegraph's reported that they've changed the way immigration's reported, so the figure's actually over 450,000. Well, that's a lie already. But then on top of that, they've removed the child benefit cap. There was a 2-child benefit cap put in place for unemployed parents. So the benefits they would get would be capped at 2 children. And this was to prevent people sitting at home and turning their house into some kind of breeding centre where they got paid to have unlimited children. Everyone knew that. Everyone knew that. Well, Labour have removed that. Well, who are the 3 biggest family groups in Britain? I can tell you. The 3 biggest family groups in order are Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and Indians. So what have Labour just done? Labour have just sanctioned a £2 billion wealth transfer from overwhelmingly white Britons who are going to work, working hard and struggling to pay for their families legitimately. And this money will go to families from the Indian subcontinent that are outbreeding us. And there you have a naked government breeding program that indirectly discriminates against white Britons. And indirect discrimination is a term most people will have heard, because what it actually means is a policy that doesn't directly name a racial or ethnic group, but indirectly, overwhelmingly, disadvantages one group to the benefit of another. So this is indirect discrimination against white Britons to the benefit of these 3 other ethnic groups. But that's a Labour policy. That's essentially a breeding policy. And add that into the mix with what I've said about maternity wards and everything. We are staring down the barrel of a demographic catastrophe. And the final thing I'll say is, when we become a minority, we're not going to be treated like other minorities. There won't be special centres for us. There won't be special funds for us. There won't be privileges for us as a minority. We will be a hated and despised minority that are unfairly blamed for everything that goes wrong in Britain. So as the multicultural society breaks down, we're going to be the ones that get the blame for it. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. I mean, there's so many things to touch on, but the in-group loyalty is so clear. And I think for me, it became so apparent in, like you said, BLM. And everyone is just looking primarily after their own group's interest. Anthony Joshua is a great example. We also saw, you're right, it's just so normalized to attack kind of the white population. You know, I hate the term white, but it's the one that they always use. So, okay, this is, if we're gonna label it the right way. We saw it recently too. Like, there is a systemic oppression against white people. The RAF said that they didn't want to hire any white pilots. We saw the BBC, I think they have all these campaigns for specifically hiring minorities. But again, like, if you care about the indigenous, this is always one of the talking points of the left. They care about the indigenous indigenous peoples of that group. But this only applies when it's not white people, it seems. And what was your last point you just made there on the end?
That when we become a minority, we're not going to benefit from the minority status that other groups now benefit from. We'll actually be treated as sort of the whipping boy for everything that goes wrong. So when things go wrong in the multicultural society, it's white people that get the blame. So we won't be a privileged minority, we'll be a hated minority. And if you look at the way whites are treated in towns and cities where they've already become a minority, it's shocking.
Yeah. And like, this shouldn't be hard to see. I mean, like you say, there's the narrative that we were the colonizers and we were the slave owners. Like, okay, yeah, this is true, but again, you could say every country,
Well,
every
look,
nation.
that's very misleading. That's very misleading.
Well, like,
I'll explain.
well, just to finish up, and then it's all yours for sure. But I mean, what I mean is, you could label that with us, but you're just taking such a minute part of our history and making as if it's the whole thing, when in reality, you know, we have the Ottoman Empire, we have all of these. Every nation on earth were slave traders at one point. So to just single out one group is just so dishonest and disgusting. But yeah, all I was going to say is we can kind of already see what that will be like. You know, if we become a minority, we see in South Africa how the white minority gets treated. We've seen it already play out. I mean, we saw, I mean, for me, again, Black Lives Matter made it so obvious how much racial hatred there was towards white people. So it's like, it's just, when it happens, yeah, we put ourselves at a disadvantage by trying to sympathize and trying, if we were coming at this like we were 95% of the population, then I completely understand, right? We need to be on our best behavior and we need to welcome people in. But that's not the dynamic anymore. And do people really think that once we become a minority, they're going to just completely switch their programming? It's ridiculous, you know?
Well, look, the interesting thing about slavery is slavery, if you look at human history, is the norm. Throughout the whole of human history, every racial group has at one point or another been owned as slaves, including whites, and at every point in history has also owned slaves, including whites. So black people have been owned as slaves. Black people have also owned slaves. White people have been owned as slaves, and obviously white people have also themselves owned slaves. This was the historical norm. What is the historical outlier is the fact that only one racial group as a whole has rejected slavery, and that is white people. And it was actually Britain that was at the very center of the global fight against slavery. Slavery was never legal in Britain, and in fact, people who brought their slaves to Britain were told in courts of law that as soon as their slaves set foot on English soil, they became a free man. Simple as. The British Empire dedicated an unfathomable amount of resources to defeating slavery. And then if you come to the modern day, which part of the world is the only part of the world where slavery doesn't exist, where slavery is still outlawed? Well, it's here. It's in Western nations. We do not tolerate slavery. If you go to Africa, there are black people who own slaves in Africa. If you go to the Far East, there are people in the Far East who own slaves. Go to Israel. There is sex slavery taking place in Israel today. And elsewhere in the Middle East, there is slavery today in countries like Libya, but there isn't in the West. So blaming us for slavery is, again, a disingenuous tactic that the media and the establishment use to make white people hate themselves, because when we hate ourselves, we are less likely to breed, we are less likely to want to be positive about in-group preference, and we're also more likely to feel as if we should accept racial and ethnic aliens into our country as some kind of penance for all the terrible things we did in the past, which is completely wrong. I mean, if you look at the slave trade, the Arab slave trade from Africa, that was the most brutal, and you can look this up, that was the most brutal slave trade imaginable. And it involved not only the transportation of huge numbers of Africans to the Middle East, but they were all castrated before they were taken there, so they couldn't breed. Now, this is something which is absolutely shocking, but it's not talked about in mainstream history books because it goes against the anti-white narrative. What also goes against the anti-white narrative is the fact that when white people traveled to Africa and came back with slaves, how did they do that? They didn't run around rounding people up like the history books and Hollywood films would like you to believe. They purchased black slaves from black empires. If you look at where modern day Ghana is situated today, That used to be where the Ashanti Empire was situated. And the Ashanti Empire was a black tribal empire built on gold that was procured via the selling of black slaves. The Ashanti Empire conquered other African tribes and sold the captured tribesmen to slave traders from the Middle East, from America, to slave traders. That's how it was done. But it wasn't done the way white people are brought up to believe, which means we're being fed this historically disingenuous narrative that is designed to make us hate ourselves. And at that point, you can see, again, that this replacement is not organic, it is not natural, it is not something that has come about by accident, but it is something that's been engineered. And this is why I refer to it as white genocide, because it is a plot to essentially displace and replace us. And you made a very good point earlier about branches of the government or the state, like the UK military, saying they don't want to employ white men. Well, there's an amazing article, well, not amazing, but an eye-opening article in the press last week about a black serial rapist who had been arrested for multiple sexual assaults and rapes, who was allowed to join the Metropolitan Police Force. When he joined the Metropolitan Police Force, he went on to commit several more serious sexual assaults and rapes, but this was all overlooked because the Metropolitan Police were in the middle of a diversity drive, and they valued the fact that he was a black male, and that would make their figures look good for what they were trying to achieve, above the fact that he posed a serious threat to women and girls. And that tells you a lot about the British state, doesn't it? That they would rather a black rapist took the role as a police officer than a white law-abiding man, because the black rapist was at least black, and that's who they wanted to take the job, so they could tick a box on a sheet about diversity. And if that's not anti-white hatred, I don't know what is.
Well, this is it. And, I feel so many people are waking up to this, and so many people are patriotic and they love their countries. They love England, they love the US, because this is something which seems to be affecting all of the Western nations at the same time. But it's like the tools which have kept people silent. It's becoming like very obvious to me that, I can either watch everything fall apart, and I'm sure this was the same situation you saw yourself in. I can either watch everything fall apart and just all your culture, all your country just fade away to nothing, or I can get called racist and try and do something about it. And so a lot of people are waking up, and they are just, the labels just don't mean anything anymore, because they're just used so frequently that it's diluted any meaning in the words. It's diluted the meaning of racism, anti-Semitism. These just get thrown around way too easily. And it's a situation where we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. So we might as well go for it, in my opinion,
Well, of course, but these words that you talk about, they are words that our enemies use, not only as a silencing tactic, but as an excuse not to debate, not to engage in good faith discussion. So if you make a point, if you were to make a point like I have done today about the demographics in Britain, and you made that point to a liberal, how would they respond? Well, they couldn't respond really in a sensible manner, because you can't argue with the facts. You can't really argue with anything I've said today because it's factual. So instead, you scream racist, anti-Semite, bigot, Islamophobe. There were countless words designed as a silencing tactic. Now, this has the effect on normal people of causing them to sort of duck and run for cover, because these words have been so ingrained in the population, they produce this Pavlovian response, where as soon as somebody shouts racist, every white person gets on their hands and knees, begins groveling and apologizing, and it prevents us from talking about serious issues. And what has this led to? Well, hundreds of thousands of white British girls have been groomed, sexually assaulted, raped, trafficked, and even murdered by men who are largely of Pakistani Muslim descent. And people aren't talking about it. They didn't talk about it. Entire police forces wouldn't act on it. Councils covered it up. Social services turned a blind eye to it because the term racism was repeatedly deployed against anyone who was willing to blow the whistle on this, which tells you something very worrying about the state of Britain, that people are more concerned or more worried about being called racist than they are about hundreds of thousands of white girls being raped. And in some cases, you actually have parents, carers, and social services that are so terrified of being called racists, they allow unthinkable things to happen to those in their care. And there was a perfect example of this, and anyone can Google this at home. A member of social services attended a wedding of an underage girl to a migrant man. Now, it is illegal to get married in Britain if you're under the age of 16. So why did a social worker attend a wedding and allow it to go ahead when the bride was under the age of consent? And it's important to remember, you cannot marry somebody who is under the age of consent, because part of marriage is consummation. For the marriage to be a legally binding agreement, it has to be consummated on the wedding night. If you marry somebody and you don't sleep with them, it's not consummated. That's actually part of it. Well, you can't consummate something with an underage individual. But this was allowed to go ahead, and a social worker actually stood there throughout this marriage ceremony. Why didn't the social worker call the police? Why didn't the social worker grab the girl and make a run for it? Because the man marrying that girl, the man forcing that girl into a forced underage marriage, was not white. So it goes ahead. Because nobody will talk about these things or speak out, because they are more worried about being called a racist. Because if you're called a racist, you could lose your job, you could lose your bank account. There's so much social capital on the line as well. You'd lose your friends. Members of your family might not talk to you anymore. What if it's reported in the paper that you, as social worker X, were sacked after accusations of racism? Would you even get another job? Would it affect your pension plan? Oh, well, better keep my head down and not say anything as this underage girl is raped by the man who is forcing her into an illegal marriage. And all of these things take place in Britain. And I believe what we're hearing about in the press, I believe these stories that actually reach the press, the ones that I'm, talking about now that, your listeners or your viewers can Google, I think they're the tip of the iceberg. I think if we're hearing about some of these things now, what lies beneath the watermark would be much greater. And exactly as it was with the grooming scandal. Originally, the grooming scandal broke in about 2004. It was myself and people in the BNP who originally blew the whistle on it. The original expose took place in a place called Keighley in West Yorkshire. That was the first small town where the grooming scandal came to light. And at the time, all the authorities said this is an isolated problem. It's a problem in this one small town. The Labour Party were going to get a grip of it. The police were going to intervene. And then it blew up. It was Rotherham. It was Telford. It was all over South Manchester. In fact, the whole of Britain was experiencing this problem. But originally, Keighley was the tip of the iceberg. Then we looked under the waterline and it was everywhere. And it's all because, or not all, but it's largely because people are scared of being called racist. People are scared of talking out when white people are the victims of what are essentially racially motivated crimes. And we've seen this. We've seen young white lads murdered by people from ethnic minority backgrounds. Do those cases of murder, do these sexual assaults get the same amount of coverage as something like the Stephen Lawrence murder? No. And if you're answering no, you've got to ask, well, why? Why aren't they getting the same coverage? They're not getting the same coverage because when the victim is white and the perpetrator is from a different foreign ethnic group, it doesn't meet the credentials that the press have to meet when they're going to make a story go huge. If it doesn't meet a series of criteria that the press look at and say, well, this can be the big story, then it just goes down the memory hole. And then you have to say, well, the media are part of this conspiracy to replace white British people by memory holing serious and refusing to investigate serious crimes that take place against the indigenous people.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, I guess just to go one further with what you were saying with everyone was too scared to be labeled racist, I think it's also a two-pronged attack. Because it's again this in-group loyalty. We saw it with Sadiq Khan. He was getting grilled on like, oh, would you be willing to investigate potential rape gangs in London? And he was just like, you saw the interview, I'm sure, but he's just squirming, literally trying every way he can to avoid answering the question because he wasn't willing to do it. Because it seems that majority of these Pakistani rape gangs are also Islamic. So it's again just more obvious in-group loyalty, like right in front of us. And I think we are all waking up to this, and I think the alternative media has done a great job at shining a light on this. I was gonna ask you what you thought about the replacement theories, but you know, you've pretty much answered. It's not a theory at this point.
Well, no, but again, this is the thing, isn't it? How many years ago? This will be a very short point, but how many years ago did we all hear that the Great Replacement was a conspiracy theory? And those who were talking about the Great Replacement, they were liars, they were kooks, they were cranks, they were racists who were making it up. Now we're being told, well, the Great Replacement is happening, but it's good because it makes the country more diverse. We have all this great food. We need these, Somalians and Nigerians to come here and care for all the pensioners because white people are now old. It's driving the housing market. It's ensuring that we won't have an aging population. So all of a sudden it's gone from these people are racist cranks and making it up to embrace it. We assure you it's going to be good for you. And anyone who's got the sort of brain plugged in is going to sit back and say, well, I thought you guys said it wasn't happening. And you can actually see articles in papers like The Guardian that will say the Great Replacement conspiracy theory is one of the most dangerous, things to be out there on the internet. And then a year or so later, they'll be like, why a white British minority is actually a good thing. And you're like, I thought that was and you've seen that from people like Ash Sakar. People like Ash Sakar have in the past called it a conspiracy theory. And then later they have sat in front of a camera and literally rejoiced at the idea of white Britons being a minority.
Yeah. Yes, lads, we're winning. Yeah. Brilliant.
Exactly. That's the one.
Yeah. Yeah. This is it. I mean, this is how I feel with the leftists too. There's just been so much, like the white British leftist. There's just been so much programming, and I was a victim of that too. But like you said with the Great Replacement, when it becomes so obvious that you are just getting gaslit on a level you've never seen, and it's these are supposedly trusted institutions. I always bring it back to COVID because this was like, if COVID didn't radicalize you, I don't know what will. The level of gaslighting we saw then was insane. But okay, so one of the things which is kind of concerning too.
If you want me to talk a little bit about COVID, we were one of the few groups in the UK that put out leaflets against the restrictions and against the mass jabbing program, and I actually produced videos explaining why the COVID jabs were not vaccinations in the traditional sense. And I went into sort of an actual scientific, explanation of what a vaccination is, how it's produced and what it does to the body, and why the COVID jabs were not that, and how they could potentially lead to an autoimmune response, which would end up killing people, which they did. And again, I was called a conspiracy theory, a nutcase. I lost my YouTube channel around that time. I haven't been given it back. I was accused of all sorts of things, vaccine disinformation. I was accused of racism, never allowed my YouTube channel back, but I was on the front line in that fight as well because, I found the COVID restrictions to be draconian and also completely unwarranted. And now we're seeing a situation where many people had their lives ruined because of COVID. And a lot of government
You mean from the jabs, not just the censorship?
Yeah. A lot of, from the jabs, from the restrictions, from the damage it did to businesses. But people in the government at the time got very, very rich from this because all of those Nightingale hospitals that they built, that they kitted out, that they had all that PPE sent to, they were never used. And they were building them, they were setting them up, they were sending huge amounts of resources there, and billions and billions of pounds of taxpayers' money was spent on those institutions, buildings, which were never used, and people got very, very rich from all of that. And those people who got very, very rich will now quietly walk away, enjoy their millions. Same with all of the people in the government who had stocks and shares in companies like Pfizer. You've got to remember, every doctor in Britain, every GP was given something like a £15 bonus for every person they administered a COVID shot to. Now, that is a powerful financial incentive. And people are saying, well, how would you get all these people to do something that is bad for people? Well, if you're jabbing 20 people a day, that's an extra 300 quid in your back pocket per day. And if you're doing that 6 days a week, that's a powerful incentive to keep doing something and not ask any questions about it. Trust the science. The government are always right. And now it's all being brushed under the carpet. And there will never be a meaningful inquiry into the money spent, who got rich, and how much damage it did to the public.
Yeah. And no one really is willing to say that they messed up or made a mistake from the government's point of view. But yeah, I mean, that is described as the greatest transfer of wealth. And, why is it that all of the big brands, Amazon, Asda, supermarkets, whatever, they're all allowed to stay open. But if you are a family who is dependent on your business, no, I'm sorry, you don't make the cut. None of it, when you look back, none of it made sense. And, and it wasn't just people like yourself. One of the people that I followed, and I think he did such a great job, Asim Malhotra. And at some point he was dubbed the best cardiologist in the UK. And he was one of the people shouting and screaming about this as well. Same as yourself. He was just taken off all the airways, as so many other doctors in the US as well. And what I wanted to bring it back to, though, was we're seeing like the Green Party is surging as well. And Zach Polanski, one of his big policies is open borders. And, what I will say about people on the left is they can see the problems that the right can as well. They can see, they have this huge push that we just need to tax the rich. We just need to take the money from the billionaires and distribute it. But what would you say what would you say they've gotten wrong, especially with like the open border policies? What do you think they miss?
Well, I think the Green Party is a perfect example of another phenomenon that I've talked about. And this phenomenon is much more visible now in America. What we're seeing within the West is a breakup of the traditional nation state. And there are many fault lines. So earlier we talked about Britain becoming sort of a multiracial state. And I think that's the important thing to talk about. It's a multiracial, multi-ethnic state. This isn't a black and white thing when it comes to race and ethnicity. Britain is now becoming a place where you might go to a small town and it's English. You might go to a small town and it's Sunni Muslim, or it might be Shiite Muslim, it might be Hindu. There might be an area of town which is completely dominated by Sikhs. There are parts of London that are completely black. But we're also seeing fault lines across political lines. violence. And we are seeing this deepening divide between people across political lines. So within communities, there are these divides, especially within white communities, there are these divides along political lines, which are becoming irreconcilable. So in America, you are seeing people now unable to sit at the same table at Thanksgiving with members of their family, because some of the family support Donald Trump and they support closed borders, they support remigration, they support ICE and deportations, and then you will have other people in that family and they will support open borders, they will support refugee rights, sanctuary cities, and these people are now in a situation which, if it was a divorce, you would say they were suffering from irreconcilable differences, because that's the thing that most people today, especially in America, put on the divorce proceedings, especially if you see celebrities. It's always irreconcilable differences, i.e. you can't sit at the table with each other without wanting to murder one another. And that's what's happening to families, friendship groups, communities, and the same is happening here in the UK. You are seeing a huge shift towards reform. You are seeing lots of people say, enough is enough, we want to close our borders, legal immigration needs to be reduced down to something like 10,000 a year, illegal immigration needs to be completely stopped, we don't want the demographic shift to go any further. And that is making a lot of headlines. But equally, there are people in the Labour Party, in Jeremy Corbyn's movement, in the Green Party, in the Lib Dems, that feel the exact opposite, that say, no, we should be welcoming these people across the borders. We should be giving them legal help. We should be rolling out the red carpet. We need to increase immigration. That's what some people are saying. And I believe that the UK is usually downstream from what happens in America. People always used to say when America sneezes, the UK catches a cold. And I do believe that. I believe we're still in a situation where America is the dominant force in the world, and definitely in the Western Hemisphere, definitely in the West. And fundamentally, in Britain, you are going to now see a polarization in politics. And as a more populist hard right, and I know, well, reform's not really hard right, but as a more populist anti-immigration right rises, you will see a counterbalance to that, which will be a vocal pushback from parties like the Greens. And what you're going to see with Labour is Labour are going to look at that, and I think the Labour Party are going to try to win that ground back. So if you look at Keir Starmer's speech at the last Labour Party conference, he openly declared war upon white anti-immigration activists. He said, if there's people out there that say you need to be white to be English or white to be British, he said, we're going to declare war on those people. We're going to shut them down. This country was built on diversity. It was built on immigration. That's what the Labour Party stands for. He got rapturous applause. And parties like the Labour Party are going to shift left. You're going to see this absolute divide, and it's going to widen and widen, which is the opposite of what happened post-war. So post-war in this country, up until about the year 2000, you saw, well, actually beyond the year 2000, up until very, very recently, you saw the parties getting closer and closer. So when the Labour Party first formed, it was very much a workers' rights party supported by people who just wanted better conditions at work and better pay for people who were literally risking their lives in factories and down coal mines. And over time, the Labour Party became more and more like the Conservative Party until they became what is now known as the Uni Party. They more or less stand for exactly the same thing. Whichever you vote for, you get more immigration, and you get more immigration, more diversity, higher taxes. It's the same whichever party you vote for. But now we're seeing the rapid reversal of that, where reform are pulling people to the right, so to speak. I know it's more complex than just right and left. And you have the Greens and the Corbyn movement pulling people to the left. And both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party will have to adjust rapidly if they want to survive in that kind of changing environment. So I actually see the rise of the Green Party as kind of a very logical and understandable counterbalance to reform. And I think we're moving into this sort of unprecedented period of history, which will sort of mimic more what you saw in the interwar period in the 20th century. So between the First and Second World War, there were the rise of your hard left communist movements, but there were also the rise of nationalist and fascist movements, and there were irreconcilable differences between the people in those two movements. And you see that on the British streets. You will see anti-migrant hotel demonstrations, and opposite them, you will see people holding up stand up to racism banners, open borders placards, cheering for more immigration. And these people are never going to be able to sit in the same room and work out their differences, because what they want for this country are two diametrically opposed end goals.
Yeah. And the problem is, too, it doesn't really take much digging to see what would happen, again, if we became the minority, or if other groups took power. The one I always talk about is the revolution in Iran. And the far left teams up with Islam. Islam comes into power, and they turn around and kill 10,000 of the far left, thinking, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But we just know it doesn't play out like that. So I kind of feel that they are living a very sheltered life, and they don't explore, these no-go zones which are popping up everywhere, or they are just willfully ignorant and not willing to put the time in to just accept that we are probably it seems like we are the most tolerant to this. And we, especially when you're younger, this was the same case for me, we just assume everyone thinks the same way as us, but different cultures, it's very clear that that's not the case. Just 1
second. Let's just talk about the word tolerance, because
Sure.
I always love the use of the word tolerance. Tolerance is not a virtue. So if you go on a long walk and you get a stone in your shoe, you might tolerate that stone in your shoe. You might be like, oh, well, it's slightly annoying, but I can tolerate it. And eventually it becomes intolerable, and you take your shoe off and you flick the stone out and you carry on. You don't tolerate things you like, do you? You don't tolerate something you enjoy or something that enriches your life. You tolerate something that is something that makes your life worse. It's something you have to do under duress. You tolerate something that makes your life slightly more uncomfortable. You tolerate being taxed. You tolerate paying a large parking charge to put your car in a multi-story car park when you go Christmas shopping. These aren't things you enjoy, you tolerate them. So when the government says you have to tolerate this and tolerance is a virtue, basically what they're saying is, we are going to smile at you the more you grit your teeth and refuse to talk about things that annoy you and make your life worse. And the idea that we've turned, not saying things about the things that make our life worse, and in some cases, lead to our daughters and sisters and young girls being raped. The fact that has become a cult of positivity. Well, the more you tolerate it, the better the person you are. It tells you that we are living in a society dominated by media like BS and government lies. We have turned something that is damaging to us into something you get an award if you engage with that. Well, you shouldn't get an award for keeping silent when things make your life worse. The whole point of having a representative democracy is that you don't have to tolerate things, that you speak out, and those who represent you act accordingly and bring into law the things that you desire. The whole point of electing a member of parliament is that your views are represented by that member of parliament in Westminster, and then the government acts accordingly. You don't elect somebody who then tells you what you have to tolerate. That's not representative democracy. And I've made a number of videos on this. And one thing that always gets brought up when people slander me is they say that I'm anti-democratic. Well, I'm not anti-democratic at all. I understand what democracy is and regularly point out that we don't actually live in a representative democracy. And the parliamentary democracy that we live under has become effectively a two-party oligarchy that provides us with nothing more than an elected dictatorship, which often does the very opposite to what the people voted for. And the perfect example of that is Brexit. People voted to leave the European Union on the basis they were sick of high immigration. And what did the government provide? Well, we didn't properly leave the European Union, and we got more immigration. Well, that's a perfect example that the democracy, or the democracy that we live under, isn't actually what it's sold to us as.
Yeah, exactly. By the people, for the people, but it's doing exactly the opposite. And, you mentioned about the divide, and this gets thrown around a lot recently, but the idea of the civil war, do you think that could be a possibility?
I actually don't. I've got a sort of a more nuanced take on this. I've got a book called The Fall of Western Man, and in my book I make a prediction. I say that there isn't going to be some civil war and there isn't going to be a race war. Things don't happen like that. Areas get taken over door by door, street by street, town by town, and city by city. And what that leads to is a situation that we've already seen. And I actually have precedent for my theory. I think if you have a theory, you should at least cite precedent. You should at least give an example of how things have played out that would lead you to the conclusions that you have come to. And I do. Look at Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland was a sectarian society where different communities that were split along ethnic and religious grounds lived the other side of what were known as peace lines. And peace lines, for those who don't know, were huge walls with big fences on top, covered in barbed wire, that stopped the Catholics and Protestants launching missiles. When I say missiles, I don't mean literal missiles. I mean sort of petrol bombs and bricks into each other's houses. And I think that's what's going to happen here. I think we're going to see a multi-ethnic sectarian Britain where you have areas that are Sunni Muslim, Shiite Muslim, areas that are Hindu, areas that are Sikh, and you're going to see multi-ethnic conflicts. It's not going to be some like race war where it's all the white Brits against all people who've got a foreign background. It won't happen like that. We've already seen inter-ethnic conflict between Hindus and Muslims. We've seen inter-ethnic conflict between black gangs in London on an almost daily basis because they live in different postcodes. These are all examples of the beginnings of a multi-ethnic sectarian Britain, where you will say, well, look, this town is a white English town. That's where white English people flee to go and live. But this town, like somewhere like Savile Town in Dewsbury, that will be a Muslim area, run by Muslims, for Muslims, and they will live there almost exclusively. Go to parts of London. There are parts of London. Can you remember that place where UKIP tried to march at the end of last year and they got told they couldn't by the police because if they went there with sort of 75 people, they were basically going to get murdered. And all the Bangladeshis came out on the streets and said, we don't want them here. Wow. Well, look at that part of London. It is completely run by the Bangladeshi community. They all cluster there. They live there. They've taken over all of the local institutions. They've had their religious buildings, their community buildings built there, or taken over buildings and installed their own people. They have taken over the local council there. They've elected their own officials. And that area is now a Bangladeshi area. Now, I would imagine that that Bangladeshi community would be very upset, or they were very upset when UKIP tried to march through there. But I think they'd also be very upset if a group of Hindus or Sikhs or, Africans tried to march through there. So what you're going to get is all these different groups. They will all take over their own areas and they will all vie for the biggest piece of the pie that they can attain for their own group, because all of them have a very, very, how can I say it? They all have in-group preference, but it's not just in-group preference. They have an extreme in-group preference where they only want to be around their own people. And if you, as sort of an Englishman, went to an area like that, you might not even be able to live there even if you wanted to. And I'm not saying because they would necessarily be violent to you. I mean, you'd go to the shops and no one would speak English. You'd get a pamphlet from the council and it'd all be printed in their language. You know, you would want your child to go to the school and your child would be the only person at the school speaking English. So these places become exclusively for one group. But then as those areas grow and as they butt up against other areas filled with different ethnic groups, there will be a clash, because all of these groups want different things. And crucially, they all want the biggest piece of the pie for themselves. And that leads to conflict. And it's why every time you've had these multi-ethnic societies, it has led to these sectarian societies. Now, you could say, well, in Eastern Europe, that happened, and it did lead to war. And yes, it did. But Britain and Eastern Europe are different places. And we live under one of the most aggressive and intrusive surveillance states. We have a highly militarized police force. We don't have access to things like firearms. So it's very unlikely that there would be a kind of all-out war like you saw in Eastern Europe. It's likely to lead to a simmering conflict that flares up at different times, just like we saw in Northern Ireland, which is obviously, you know, Northern Ireland is part of the UK, so that is an example that is very close to us here on the mainland of what can happen when you get these two communities living together under a surveillance state, which has effectively disarmed both communities. So you just have that simmering tension for decades.
Yeah. Well, then I guess that leads on quite nicely then. So let's say you're in charge. I mean, we recently saw Steve Laws. He's gone viral a few times, and he has a very much hard line on immigration. And, you know, when you're describing this, I can understand where he's coming from. You know, being told that you've been sectioned out of your own country, who would want that, right? And if the end result of having a multicultural country means that it's not only sectioning it off for the natives, but it's also sectioning it off for each individual group, I'm sure each individual group is also unhappy. You know, no one wins. So, yeah, I can understand in some ways. I wouldn't have had as hard a line as Steve myself, but like, what would your stance on that be?
Well, my stance is, first, if I came to power tomorrow, and obviously that's highly unlikely, but let's say I did, and say I had the power to actually change things. So what you're saying is I become some kind of the Emperor of Britain tomorrow, and I have the supreme ability to actually put into practice the things I want. And this obviously completely sidesteps the fact that we have this massive civil service that actually prevents people passing legislation that our equivalent of the deep state doesn't like. But in this sort of fantasy scenario, I am now Emperor Mark, and I'm in charge of everything. Well, the first thing I would do was completely stop immigration into Britain. To come to Britain, you need to be either white British or be able to prove ethnic heritage. So there would be limited immigration from places like South Africa or Australia where people actually had heritage, and it would be sort of a right to return. I would then completely guard our southern border. It would put an end to illegal immigration too. And the next thing, once I'd stopped immigration, and that would be, we'd be stopping immigration immediately, but we'll come back to immigration a little bit later. I would then start deporting all illegal immigrants and anyone here legally that had committed any kind of crime, regardless of what it is. If you've come here legally and, you've gone into a shop and stolen whatever people shoplift today, like when I was a kid, it was CDs, but probably your audience don't even know what a CD is, but people used to go and, shoplift CDs. Regardless of what it was, if you've gone and you've been a shoplifter, you're going. If you've come into our house as a guest and you've broken the rules, you are going. Then we would start bringing in laws that put the indigenous people first and linked benefits to being able to speak English, to being able to write English. We would do things like ban ritual slaughter, so halal and kosher slaughter would be outlawed. And then we would offer people generous grants of about £15,000 per person to return to their ancestral homeland. So we would have remigration. And there would be obviously these several phases of people going back. And we would aim for something like, well, we would aim for 95% white British. And 95% white British would establish what I would call an ethnic supermajority, turning Britain into an ethno-state. But I think that would make allowances for people. And you do have to make allowances, because look at Britain now. There's 70 million people here. 21 million of those are from a migrant background. And some of those people, you might have a young lad, you know, he's an eighth black, or sort of a quarter black. His dad was half black. His dad came from Jamaica. Well, this young lad, he's never set foot in Jamaica. His dad never set foot in Jamaica. His granddad came from Jamaica. Now, at that point, I think he's obviously 75% English. He's a quarter Jamaican. I think you'd have to make some kind of an exception for people that had mixed heritage, but some of it was English. You'd also make exceptions for people who were totally decent people that had come here and provided services to our people, or who had learnt the language and integrated and were good people. And, you know, you might have, you know, an elderly black couple in their 60s who, you know, work doing voluntary work at a local church. You know, they're not going to be breeding. They've had all the kids they're going to have. You're not going to be rushing to send them back. They're not an ethnic threat to us. And you would also then, when you finally sorted out the problem, make exceptions for certain people. If you had some talented Japanese brain surgeon who wanted to come here and work in a hospital saving the lives of, you know, English children that had been in car accidents and needed emergency brain surgery, you'd make that exception. You'd make exceptions for foreign diplomats, etc. But whatever you did, you would ensure that we remained 95% white British and that we were never again in jeopardy of becoming a minority in our own homeland. And I think this is important to talk about this, because look, I really love Steve Laws. He's a friend of mine. I get on with him very well. And I understand why he says we always need to say it's got to be 100% white British. And he's talked about, you know, essentially medical records and DNA tests, etc. But I think that scares a lot of normal people when you go that far. And I think when we're talking about making policy and we're talking about asking the public to accept something, when you do have 21 million people with a migrant background here in Britain, there are lots of white Britons who have a member of their family who is mixed race. There's a lot of white Britons who know somebody who has maybe lived here for several generations, or is an ethnic minority that was, you know, born here, that they get on with. And I think most people would like to be reassured that the people who have come here in good faith or are of mixed race origin, that, you know, like our culture and way of life, there would be a small exception carved out for them. And it's interesting because when you talk about people from a mixed race origin, when we saw Black Lives Matter, you had people who were, you know, a quarter black, and they were on the streets demanding reparations, thinking they should get, you know, £1 million because they're a quarter black, and, you know, they were down with the brothers. But you do also get a minority of people with a mixed race background who tend toward the white British side of their family. And I think if you have a family, let's just say there's an ethnically mixed family where in the extended family there's 20 to 30 people, but amongst them there is one sort of half caste, you know, half African, half white British little boy or little girl. If you say to those people, well, you know, your nephew or niece, your brother, your sister, your grandson, your granddaughter, we're going to whip them out of school. You know, they're only 5 years old. We're going to whip them out of school, put them on a boat and send them to a country and dump them in the middle of nowhere where they've never been before, they don't know, and they're probably going to perish in that sort of situation. That would probably put the rest of the family off voting for your ideas. So I think you need to come up with a policy that does ensure we remain a supermajority, but also gives people what they feel is the moral right to vote for you. Because white people are very moralistic. White people are very empathetic. They look at things from the point of view often of other racial groups. They don't like to be impolite. They don't like to do things that might make other people uncomfortable. I mean, this is part of the reason we're in this mess, because we do have this empathy, which is largely unique to our people. But I think you have to, I'm not cucking, but you have to come up with a policy that pleases people. And even if I was emperor tomorrow and I came up with a policy that disgusted people, they would just rise up and they wouldn't go along with it.
Yeah, no, I think that's important, and I haven't got anything against Steve Laws myself. I don't know him personally or anything, but yeah, I mean, because he has such a hard line. I mean, for example, if you did have the half caste, and let's say it's a British mother with a black man, and they have a kid, that kid has a lineage. So they have every right to the country, just like me, yourself, in my eyes, right? They have a traceable lineage. And I think that should be the grounds of why you get to stay. But if there's people who have naturally self-segregated and they have no intention of learning the language, of interacting, or even trying to be part of the community, how can you have a coherent country? And if you have this everywhere and no one talks to each other, like what is that? Well,
look, that's exactly the point. And I think if you said tomorrow that all benefit claims in Britain were linked to the ability to speak the language and to fill in the form in English, not with an interpreter sat at your side, because currently the government burns, I think it's hundreds of millions of pounds a year on interpreters for ethnic minorities in both hospitals, council chambers, at immigration centres, etc. If you actually said that to be here and to claim any form of benefit or to use the NHS, you had to speak English and fill out all the forms in English, that would largely solve your problems overnight. And the vast majority of people would agree with a policy like that. If you did like a little vox pop, if you went out onto the streets and you interviewed white Britons and you said, look, you're part of the, indigenous population. Do you believe that to come here and claim benefits, or to claim benefits in this country and to use the services that taxpayers provide, you should be able to speak English and write English? I think the vast majority would say, well, yeah, it's common sense. So we're not actually asking for things that I'm not asking for anything that I think is particularly outrageous, which again circles back to what we said at the beginning, that I'm so heavily banned on social media and I am so debanked and so banned from traveling. But the points that I'm making to you now, if this was being done with a black screen and it didn't say Mark Collett at the bottom and it was just like, this is what this random British politician thinks, everyone would be cheering and saying, who is this guy? We need this guy as Prime Minister. But because it's me and because I'm so heavily banned and so heavily censored, people think I'm sort of the devil incarnate. Like the European Union has basically condemned me as Europe's most dangerous, in their terms. They have designated me as that. But everything that I'm saying today, I think would be, or the vast majority of it, I can't think what would be contentious. I think pretty much everything I've said today would be embraced by indigenous Brits who are now crying out for these sort of policies. But instead, I get banned, and then you get people who say sort of more radical things, boosted up. And I kind of look at that and think, well, why am I the one that gets the ban?
Yeah, and I mean, people are looking towards that as if maybe it's a honeypot. Is it trying to rile up people or whatever? But I as it stands, don't worry. I know.
Well, I just want to say, I don't think Steve Laws is a honeypot. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying
but I mean, because they allow these voices out there, it encourages other people to speak out.
I think X is a honeypot. I think Elon Musk, when you actually look at what Elon Musk stands for, and look, when you look at what somebody stands for, you have to look at the way they live their life, not at what they say. Look at a man's actions. So if I said to you today, which I have, I am anti-immigration, I have in-group preference, and I want to put white Brits first. If you then found out I had a large car factory making electric vehicles, and I had a truck called, we'll call it the future truck, and I was employing Indians and Mexicans to make my future truck in my car factory, you'd say, well, hey, Mark, that's a little bit weird. It's a bit weird that you're sacking all the white Brits to employ these migrants to make your future truck when you've got this massive social network where you appear to be saying that we should be putting white people first. That would be a bit of a contradiction. And maybe what I'm saying here is that there's a powerful guy who owns X that says one thing and riles people up, but when it comes to his employment practices and his defense of bringing Indians into America, that is very different to his public persona on social media. Now, obviously, Elon Musk isn't going to let me back on X because I say these uncomfortable things. And instead, he chooses to boost other people. But I think what I'm saying is coherent. And I actually do live the way that I talk. You know, I want to build, you know, positive, ethnocentric, homogenous, white British communities, and I advocate for that, and I attempt to do that. But even in my organisation, you don't have to be white British to join. We do say that if, you know, people agree with us and, you know, they speak English, etc., we do make that exception, like I would if I was in power. You know, so I do think I'm a fair person as well. And I do have people that I work with regularly. I do have people that I talk to regularly who are from other ethnic groups. And I make it very clear. If you've seen my interview with Dilly Hussein, who's a Muslim that does the 5 Pillars podcast, you know, I said to him, I would prefer you to go home. And in an ideal world, you wouldn't be living here. But also in an ideal world, Britain wouldn't be bombing the Middle East and wouldn't be imposing sanctions on Arab nations that drove people to leave the Middle East and come here. You know, there would be a world full of ethno-states, and if we wish to trade, if we wish to get along, we could, but we wouldn't be bombing each other, and Britain wouldn't be fighting wars in the Middle East. So I am also very honest with people from ethnic minority backgrounds who I work with. You know, there's no lying for me. I'm not going to sit here, you're not going to catch me on another podcast saying something different. I'm consistent across the board and have been consistent for the last 25 years.
Yeah, which is important, and especially at a time where there's so much propaganda, so much lies. Integrity is the only thing we really have, and this is where people, you know, they've completely rejected BBC, and this is where they're going to the alternative news media. Something that I wanted to ask you. So, you know, maybe if you spoke to someone on the street, someone who leans a bit right, I think most people say that their main concern would be Islam, right? And how that's affecting the country. But then you also get others that say, actually, well, Israel has played a big part in all of that, starting the wars, lobbying for all of these in the Middle East. Who do you think is the bigger concern?
Well, I think you sort of say, what comes first, the cart or the horse? What comes first, the chicken or the egg kind of situation? And there are powerful groups in the UK, like the British Board of Deputies, that are Zionists, that lobby for two very interesting things. They lobby for the British government to support the state of Israel as an ethno-state for people. So the British Board of Deputies, which is the most powerful group in the UK, they support Israel as an ethno-state, as a place for run by for where they can be safe, where they can embrace their own cultures, tradition and heritage. It's a state. However, curiously, the British Board of Deputies also lobby for open borders. for tolerance, for refugees to be able to come here. They are not opposed to English, Scottish, or Welsh people becoming a minority. And if you look at press releases from the British Board of Deputies, and this is so curious, on one hand, they want an ethno-state for in the Middle East, but on the other hand, they want a multi-ethnic, multi-racial state for the English. You're thinking, why this hypocrisy? And you see the same in America. The largest pro-immigrant group in America is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. That's the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, called HIAS, H-I-A-S. You can Google that. And they actively call for migrants to be let into America. They lobby for American cities to become sanctuary states for migrants. They lobby against Trump's border wall. They fight against ICE and deportations. Yet those same support Israel as an ethno-state. And I remember one of these pro-migrant groups saying, look, we've got a record number of rabbis signing up for open borders in America. And this woman was saying, like, you can't get all these rabbis to agree on anything except for open borders. That's the one thing they agree. The one thing they agree on is open borders in America. But at the same time, they all praise Israel and they all lobby the American government to help secure Israel's borders and to help arm Israel so it can maintain its dominance in the Middle East. And what I'm saying is, there is a powerful drive for open borders in the West, which is largely and disproportionately led by Zionists who equally want the very opposite for themselves in the Middle East. And that hypocrisy has to be called out. And these people have opened our borders. And the problem is, when they open our borders, when they create wars in the Middle East, when they create these endless streams of refugees from the Middle East, we then let them in, and those people then commit horrific, unconscionable acts upon our people. So what I'm saying is, there are two problems here. One is the problem of the migrant, and those people need to largely go back so we secure a 95% white British state. But there is also the problem of those who have opened the door and let them in. And in that case, Zionists and Zionists are disproportionately represented amongst the people who have opened the door. So I think there, I'm sort of covering both bases. You know, there's no point sitting complaining that your barn is filled with animals eating all the hay. You've got to take a look at who the stable hand is and say, well, why did you open the door and welcome the animals in? Because they've now eaten all my hay. You know, you want the animals out, but you also want to make sure that the stable boy never, ever is in charge of the barn door again, or else you're going to end up back in the same mess that you got in when he opened the barn door in the first place. You know, that's a simple analogy, but it illustrates the mess we're in. We need to ensure that Britain is run by white Britons who will put white British interests first. Britain should not be run for the betterment of Israel. It should not be run by Zionists. And Britain should also be overwhelmingly white British, 95% white British, which means sending an awful lot of people who are hostile to us back to their land of origin. And that would solve all problems and tick all boxes.
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is the thing. I mean, even the term Zionism is just like, it is the most socially accepted racism there is, you know? Why is it, like you say, it's this hypocrisy. You're allowed this ethno-state, and, you know, they're always throw back, well, it's only 75%. Yeah, but you will always be the majority rule. You will always be the most in power. And not
only that, I'm just going to stop you there. They also have rules. They also have what's called a nation-state law that specifically sets out a situation where the will always be put first, and the will have control. And what you've also got to remember is the Palestinians that do live in Israel live in giant walled concentration camps like Gaza, where they do not mix with the population. Now, that's completely different. Whereas and to go, oh, but what about October the 7th when, allegedly this happened and that happened and people died? Well, what about the hundreds of thousands of white British girls that were raped by Pakistani Muslim men? Well, at that point, the Jew will turn around and say, well, stop being racist. Why are you bringing ethnicity and race into this? And it's this double speak. And I expose this in very simple terms, which is why I'm silent. So I've made videos on all of these things. I've got an extensive video library explaining in detail how this hypocrisy, and I've also done big debates. I once debated 3 at the same time, and they sort of rage quit during the debate because they couldn't answer my points. And really, all I'm talking about is actually something else to talk about. I love talking about equality. Well, how about we get some equality? How about white Brits are treated equally with migrants or people from a migrant background? How about we aren't treated as second-class citizens? How about we're allowed an ethno-state like you're allowed an ethno-state? Because if we were treated equally and held to the same standard that these other groups were, we'd be far better off.
Yeah, this is it. It's either a rule for everyone or no one gets it at all. You can't pick and choose who gets the special privileges. And I mean, I don't think there is any other. I mean, we have countries which are massively homogenous, like Japan and China, but there's no other country that I know of that says this is a homeland specifically for. If we turn around and said we want a homeland for the whites. Just there's no one who would agree with that. But again, it's a different story when it comes to them.
Well, look, it gets worse. In places like France, the government has essentially made it illegal to say that the ethnic French people exist. To say that there is an ethnically defined group of people known as the French, it's essentially illegal for the French people to say that. And they won't even record statistics on ethnicity. It's similar in Germany. So Britain is one of the few places that records, America does too, records ethnicity. So if you look at the census, there is a clear defined section that says white British. Whereas in Germany, they have this weird classification where it says you're from a migrant background. Now, to be classified as from a migrant background, it means either you or one or more of your parents were not a German citizen. Well, what happens if you've got 2 black people, both born in Germany, both granted German citizenship at birth, and they give birth to 10 black children? Well, according to the German government, they don't have a migrant background. So the statistics you're looking at in places like Germany are completely meaningless. They'll say, oh, well, 30% of the population in Germany is from a migrant background. But as I said, if there was 2 black German citizens who gave birth to 10 black German children, all of African descent, but they're all German citizens, and none of the parents lacked German citizenship. They were all born on German soil. Well, at that point, they just get lost in the figures. There is no specific German ethnic group when you look at the figures for the makeup of the ethnicities in Germany. So what the powers in Europe have started doing, in some ways, is more insidious than what they do here in the UK. They muddy the waters so people don't know how close they are to being replaced. So they say, well, 70% of German people are German citizens. Well, okay, well, how many are actually German? Well, they don't know. It could be 2/3. It could be 60%. We don't know.
Yeah. And we almost have our own thing too. When it came to the 7/7 bombings, the Ariana Grande bombings, and the Axel Rudakabana, event, Southport, they're all British born. And the Axel Rudakabana,
Welsh choir boy.
Yeah, exactly, Welsh choir boy. So they deliberately try and paint these people as British, as white British, it's only through the Freedom of Information Acts do you actually get down to what the reality is.
I mean, look, you can't show it on the screen, but when they first showed the pictures of Axel Ruda Cabana, and they called him a Welsh choir boy, he was a little boy. He must have been about somewhere between 9 and 11 years of age. He was clearly visually a little boy. He had a smart school uniform on and a blazer. And then there was another picture of him, dressed up as Doctor Who. So they were going out of their way to show him at the most innocent point of his life and doing some things that were seen as quintessentially British. So Doctor Who dress up, quintessentially British. Little blazer and school uniform, quintessentially British. When we actually saw the picture of Axel Ruda Cabana, current day what he is, massive, unkempt afro hair, dead eyes, and the look on his face, when you saw the look on his face in that mugshot, it was terrifying. If you saw him coming down the street staring at you like that, you would literally want to just, cross the street or walk the other way as quickly as you could. And they specifically hid who he really was from the public. But not only did they hide who he was, they hid the fact he was a serial violent offender who had been stopped and intercepted maybe 24 times with knives. He brought knives into the school he was at 12 times before he was expelled. And then when he was expelled, he turned up at the school gate with a hockey stick and started beating up students and had to be restrained by teachers. He was actually found guilty on multiple times for carrying bladed weapons and threatening people. And the last time he had an interaction with the police before he went to stab those 3 girls to death, he was on a bus, he pulled out a kitchen knife, he threatened people on the bus. The police arrived, did not arrest him, took him home and lectured his mother on how to hide knives from him. Now, if he'd have been arrested promptly, if his criminal history had been looked at, and if he'd have been given a sensible jail term for repeat offences involving bladed weapons, those 3 girls would still be alive. But they're dead because the police let him off because he is black. And they let off not just Axel Ruda Cabana, they let off Valdo Calacane, the killer in the Nottingham rampage. He was let off as well. He had previously stalked a white British girl at the university he was studying. She jumped out of a building to escape him when he was tailing her. The university and the police colluded to cover that up. And just weeks before he went on his rampage, he was involved in a violent altercation at his job in a warehouse in Leicestershire, and the police let him off that as well. There is a long history of violent killers and violent offenders from ethnic minority backgrounds being allowed a free pass repeatedly by the police, social services, prevent, because of their ethnicity. Whereas young white lads download a manifesto online or buy the wrong book from W.H. Smith's and they get multi-year sentences.
Yeah. It's once you wake up to all this stuff, it is just screaming at you. And they play the same kind of tricks in the US too, and they'll label certain criminals as white to try and change the figures, right? The statistics. I've got a quick video I wanna play. Okay, here we go. Don't know if you've seen this already. Can you see that?
And I have seen it. I know the one it is, yes.
Right.
Before we start, if members of the committee could declare any relevant interests, and I will declare that I am a member and officer of Conservative Friends of Israel.
I'm a member of Labour Friends of Israel, Labour Friends of Palestine, but I'm also, for 40 years, the spouse of Lord Mann, who's the government's independent unpaid advisor on anti-Semitism.
And I'm the all-party parliamentary group chair against anti-Semitism. So
I'm a member of Labour Friends of Israel. I travelled with Labour Friends of Israel to Israel in May of last year. I also attempted to travel to Israel with the Centre for the Advancement of Arab-British Understanding and was banned from entry into Israel. I'm also a member of the Board of Deputies of British Jews.
And I received a donation from the Lib Dem Friends of Israel before the last election.
Yes. Yeah, it's
Well,
all...
this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about Zionist or power. I'm talking about a disproportionate, not all, but a disproportionate number of people within powerful positions, either being or being Zionists, or in some way being influenced by the Zionist or lobbies. And that's a clear example. Nearly everybody in that room was either a member of a Zionist lobbying group or was receiving money and free trips abroad from a Zionist lobbying group. And the same is true in America. There is a disproportionate influence on British politics by Zionists and the state of Israel. And it is unfair. And if people say to me, well, Mark, why are you getting bothered about this? I will ask you to flip the narrative. Imagine if, when asked those questions, everyone in that room had said they were either Russian or were being paid money or going on trips to Russia. They're either being paid by the Russian government or going on trips to Russia. There would be an absolute outrage. Imagine the outcry. Imagine what people would say. They'd be like, well, that politics is controlled by Russia. There's Russian agents everywhere. This is despicable. And recently, there was actually a guy from Reform who had been jailed because he'd received a payment from the Russian establishment. Yet regularly, year in, year out, dozens, sometimes hundreds of MPs travel to Israel for special meetings, for all expenses paid trips, which are essentially holidays. And many of these MPs are part of Zionist-funded groups, the Conservative Friends of Israel, Labour Friends of Israel, and they receive money from these lobbying groups. They receive donations towards their campaigns, and they receive gifts and other bonuses and little sweeteners from these groups that improve their lives. This paints a picture. The Israel lobby has a complete stranglehold, not just on UK politics, but largely on Western politics. It's actually worse in America, where AIPAC more or less runs American politics. You know, in America, when you see an election year, both presidential candidates have to give a speech at AIPAC to win over the Zionists who are present. It's just how it works. Now, it's not racist to call this out. It's not discriminatory. It certainly wouldn't be racist or discriminatory if we were talking about Russian interests or Chinese interests. But when you're talking about Israel and Zionism, it's a taboo to speak out about this. And I remember seeing Liz Truss. She was only Prime Minister for, I think it was a few weeks, I think it was less than a month actually. I remember seeing her at a Conservative Friends of Israel meeting just after she'd become Prime Minister, when she stood up and proclaimed she was a Zionist and that she would act in the interest of Israel as a British Prime Minister. Well, imagine if a British Prime Minister stood up and said that they were a super friend of Russia, and they were going to absolutely state that during their tenure as Prime Minister, they would act in the interest of the Russian Federation. There'd be outrage, and rightly so, because Britain should be run to the benefit of the indigenous people, of white British people, and the interests of white British people. Why do we have to have prime ministers, ministers, MPs that are absolutely hell-bent on running Britain to the benefit of a foreign nation?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. No, you're on it, because I know, especially the young generation, Gen Z, they are all on this. And
I've been on this for 25 years, mate. 25 years I've been talking about power and the role that Israel plays. And again, that's why I'm not put in front of Gen Z, because if I was, look, let's put it like this, if this interview we've done now went viral and got seen by, 10 million people, I mean, you'd be very happy with it, but so would I. But I think the 10 million people who saw what I had to say, regardless of their race or ethnicity, would say that I'd been extremely fair. I'm actually calling for an end to wars in the Middle East. I campaigned against the Iraq war, the Afghan war. I've campaigned against the bombing of countries like Syria and Iran and Libya by the West, because I don't want any more of these wars, because they only benefit one nation, which is Israel. So I think mostly white Britons would be on my side, but I think a lot of people in other countries would also say, this guy's talking perfect sense. Why is he painted as the devil?
Well, this is it. And then, you know, I see it myself too. Actually, there's a lot of minorities in the UK who are going to the far right because they are just as much affected as anyone else, as everyone else in the country. They don't want all the immigration as well. They like it the way they are. They went to Britain, and for it to stay that way, it needs to maintain its character, and its people make that character. And also with the whole Israel thing, then once you start to tie in Epstein, now that there's so many links between him and Mossad, the fact that he had dirt on our own royal family, the fact that, you know, he's got all the pictures of Trump, he's got the Clintons. He made it so he was with every single A-lister, anyone with power. And it's all there for people to see now. Everyone, it's clear as day. So, and it reminds me of the classic, you know, if you want to know who's in charge, look at who you can't criticize. And
yeah, exactly.
It's becoming more and more clear why you've been deplatformed so much.
Exactly. And if you look at a great example here in the UK is the huge fuss that was made over the Chinese firm Huawei and their involvement in Britain's 5G network. You know, that particular firm, whose name I probably mispronounced, has links with the Chinese government, and rightfully there were calls for that firm not to be involved in our technological infrastructure because it would allow a foreign nation to spy on us. But at the same time all that fuss is being made, you have a Mossad agent acting on behalf of the state of Israel, trafficking underage girls all around the world and using his private island as the world's biggest honeypot, and then leveraging that information over, or leveraging the footage he's got over multiple presidents, multiple state leaders, multiple influencers, celebrities, and even royal families around the world. Yet no one's saying we need to fully investigate the way that this foreign state is leveraging power over important Western individuals, governments, and heads of state. It's all swept under the mat. Well, yeah, we should make sure that our infrastructure isn't owned by China, because we don't want the Chinese spying on us. But China is not the country that is leveraging power and leading us to war on their behalf. China is not the country that is sending powerful men here with underage girls on private planes and getting those people into Buckingham Palace. You know, that's Israel, and we're not talking about that.
Yeah.
And look, this calls out Tommy Robinson as well. I'm going to call out Tommy Robinson here because that man is a moral coward. If a powerful Muslim man had brought underage girls to Britain and was embroiled in a plot to implicate the British royal family with an underage sex ring so that they could be leveraged, they could have their arms bent up their back so they would support a Muslim nation, Tommy Robinson would be outside Buckingham Palace with a megaphone, an army of lads, and a load of banners and placards asking why Muslims with underage girls were brought into Buckingham Palace. But because the man doing this was actually and operating on behalf of Israel for a Zionist agenda, Tommy Robinson isn't interested in talking about that particular paedophile ring. He's not talking about those underage girls who are abused, trafficked, and some of them murdered, because it doesn't fit his narrative. And look, I want to root out all of the foreign men abusing underage girls. I want all of the Pakistani grooming gangs to be deported immediately. But I also want powerful Zionists who are trafficking white women and setting up honeypots to leverage power in the West gone as well. I don't want them here either. And I think that's a much more coherent and moral point than Tommy makes. You know, it was just yesterday, Tommy was talking about how wonderful Iranian migrants are. Well, Iranian migrants are more than 18 times more likely to be arrested for sex offences than white British men. Why would we want them here? Well, he wants them here because he's supporting the war against Iran, because he is an Israeli stooge. He wants Iran to be bombed. He's outside the Iranian embassy protesting now, saying, oh, we need to bring the Iranians here. They're great. They'll be wonderful for Britain.
Yeah,
that's because he's paid by people who aren't interested in what's good for Britain. All you have to do is put into Google, you know, Iranian rapist or Iranian sex offender UK, and there's a list of results. We don't need these people here, but we do, because Israel says we need these people here and we need to bomb Iran. So Tommy Robinson and his travelling circus is 100% on board now with Iranians coming to Britain. Sickening.
Yeah. And this is the thing, isn't it? Because, I mean, he himself says, I'm a Zionist. So he's not shy about it. And if his whole thing, you know, he's from Luton, his whole thing is he's against the influx of Islam. Okay, why are they moving there in the first place? Well, it all ties back to Israel, all ties back to these wars. They've been displaced. And obviously, and of course, there's going to be a lot of people who are opportunists, who are just trying to make some money and whatever, or even spread Islam. Like they're all true too. They all exist. But a key part which he's missing out, which has contributed to the problem which he's fighting against, is Israel. While on that, actually, how do you feel about a lot of these right-wing commentators, podcasters? We have Liam Tufts, who I don't know if you're familiar with. We have Winston Marshall. Do you
Not familiar with him?
It's the same kind of message as Liam Tufts.
I guess what it is, but I'm just saying I've never heard.
No,
of him,
fair enough. I mean, so what do you think's going on there? Do you think that they're paid opposition?
It's controlled opposition. These people are allowed on social media and their channels are built up because they are pro-Israel. They are largely pro-multiculturalism, but they will just say, look, we're pro-multiculturalism, except for this sort of small group of Muslims that have to go. But they're being disingenuous. Who are the ones committing the knife crimes and the machete crimes? Well, it's largely the Afro-Caribbean population. Who are the people committing the myriad of phone thefts in London? Well, we know who they are. You know, Islam is a problem in Britain, but it's part of a bigger problem, which is multiculturalism and demographic change. And I don't want to be replaced by anyone. I don't want to be replaced by Pakistani Muslims. I don't want to be replaced by Indians. Tommy Robinson loves the Indians coming here. I don't want to be replaced by Afro-Caribbeans. You know, him and Liam Tufts love the Afro-Caribbeans coming here. I don't want, even if you said to me tomorrow, look, Mark, white Britons are going to be a minority and the people who are going to inherit Britain are going to be Swedes. I still wouldn't want that. I wouldn't want us to be replaced by Swedish people. They're also white. But the English, the Scottish and the Welsh are special people. They are white Britons. Britain is their home. This is the only home we have. When you talk about Israel, if Britain goes to hell, they will have a home. They can flee to Israel and there'll still be a place for them. If England is lost, what place is there for the English? And I don't care who we give up England to. I don't want to give it up to anyone. No one. It's our land. And that should be no negotiations. It should be unequivocal. This is our land. This is the place our ancestors grew up in, farmed, built. This is the place their descendants should be safe in. And that should go for any people, you know, whether it's the Swedes, whether it's the Japanese, whether it's Nigerians, whether it's Indians. India is theirs, but England is ours. And anyone that says otherwise is fundamentally lying and our enemy. You know, replacement is genocide, and we should not be victims of a white genocide.
Do you lean into the idea? So we're seeing we're seeing the West in particular getting taken out the most. I mean, I think it was like in the early 1900s, white people made up 33% of the entire globe, right? Now we're down to as low as, I've seen it, the lowest I've seen is 6%, but 6 to 10, it generally seems to range from that. So in that sense, yeah, like you couldn't deny the replacement theory. You could easily say this is a huge genocide. Do you lean into the whole that white people in particular are getting targeted? Because if this is being carried out on purpose by, you know, Jewish Zionists, say, they see white people in particular as the biggest threat. So some people believe this is all intentional. We're purposely getting taken out because we are the greatest threat to them. And they, you know, they even have resentment from Rome, because it was the Romans that got rid of Judea, and that resentment, that historical resentment, is still with a lot of them today.
Yes, I do believe that, but it isn't just us. If you go to Japan now, there are actually individuals in Japan lobbying for Japan to open its borders and to embrace multiculturalism. The same is happening in places like South Korea. And it seems that every developed nation, and developed nations aren't just in the West, there are places like Japan that have beautiful cultures, they have a storied history that stretches back for centuries. And, you know, anyone out there who knows a bit about me, they know that I'm very interested in Japanese culture. I have worked with people from both Japan and China. I have friends who are Japanese that I speak to regularly, and they are experiencing now the same attempts by the same people to open their gates and flood their country. And if you look at it like that, there is a concerted effort to flood highly developed, technologically advanced nations with high IQ, indigenous populations, with people specifically from the Indian subcontinent and Africa. And when you look at the people who are behind this drive, they are always disproportionately from the same ethnic group. That doesn't mean everyone from that ethnic group is involved. It doesn't mean others aren't involved. It just means they are disproportionately involved. And when you look at the percentage of those people in places like Japan and Korea, or if you even look at the percentage of those people, you know, in places like Britain, their involvement in this drive to bring people from the third world to developed nations cannot be understated or ignored.
Yeah. This is it. So you're quite right. We don't single out the whole group, but there is a pattern. And you couldn't say this is true for everyone. But I mean, there's it was kind of this famous tweet where Josh Hammer, you know the one I'm on about, where he essentially says all Europeans are Romans, and they are kind of their spiritual enemy. So this narrative isn't uncommon, you know, and it's something that we at least need to acknowledge, we need to be aware of. And then when you see how, I don't know, the last 30 years have played out all over the world, something you should at least pay attention to, I think.
Definitely. And I think the fact that when you notice patterns, you are called a racist. And the fact that, you know, in English law, you can actually be tried as a racist and potentially jailed. And the judge will remind you that in cases involving race laws, the truth is no defense. That's actually very worrying. So simply noticing patterns and making factual or truthful statements can actually be deemed against the law in England and Wales.
Oh, I just found the tweet. Yeah. So Josh Hammer tweeted, hatred is inherent in the European DNA. So again, if you were to say the reverse, you would be thrown off X in no time. I mean, you're a clear example of that. But still, it's stuff which a lot of people are now noticing. And yeah, Mark, really appreciate your time. This is, I knew a little bit about you, but it's been really good to really dig into what it is you stand for and all the rest of it.
Look, mate, I've really enjoyed this. And obviously, you seem like a really bright young lad. You look a lot younger than me. I would say you're sort of in your early to mid-20s at the latest. But I want to thank you for having me on, and I want to wish you all the best for the future. But if people want to know more about me, I am still available on Rumble, Odyssey, Telegram and Gab. They're the places where you can easily find me, and the places where I am still speaking the truth on an almost daily basis. But thank you for having me on. It's much appreciated. If there's ever anything I can do for you in the future, if you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to contact me.
Awesome. So if you made it this far, I just want to say thank you for listening. A few things from the chat which I thought was incredible. One, it's being very clear that people will get labeled far too easily. I'm not saying I support everything that Mark says, but it's clear that he has a lot of information on the lobbies which have a lot of power in the UK and the West. All of this has been exposed in the United States. It's time for the same thing to get exposed in the UK. People like Tommy Robinson, who claim that they are proud Zionists and say if Israel was to go to war tomorrow, he'll be there on the front lines. But he doesn't show the same support for the UK. And like it says in the Bible, no one can serve two masters. We all need to be aware, and a lot of people are aware of this already, whether it be the 7K payouts, whether it be BB himself saying that they need to try and get control over platforms like X and all the rest of it. It's very clear that they hold a lot of power and a lot of influence. And there's a lot of influencers who also push that message. I want to make that clear. And secondly, the UK really needs to be looking out for itself, the same as America should, Canada should, Australia and all the West in general. We need to really take control back of our countries. Anyways, like I say, Mark is one of the most censored people. I've already been censored once myself. I don't know how long this show is going to last, but for now, if you could all like, share, and subscribe, it will mean the world to me. Leave a comment too. I'll make sure that I read all of them. On top of that, if you're a fan of the show and you enjoy it, please leave a 5-star review. Every time that I do an episode on Muslims or I do an episode on Zionists, I get a lot of people from these groups purposely trying to lower the rating, lower the score. So if you are enjoying the content and you're finding value from this, please give me a good rating. It does help with pushing the podcast out there. Anyways, enough from me. I hope to see you next time. All the best.